The Grand Hall of Westhaven Palace had never been so quiet. Hundreds of noblemen and women stood frozen beneath glittering crystal chandeliers, each one struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Ladies dressed in gowns stitched with silver thread exchanged uneasy glances. Decorated generals lowered their eyes. Wealthy merchants whispered behind trembling hands. Even members of the royal council, men who rarely showed surprise, seemed unable to find the right words. At the center of the room stood a young woman named Grace Carter. Her hands shook gently at her sides as she tried to steady her breathing. She wore the simplest dress in the room, one she had almost decided not to wear because she believed it looked too ordinary for a royal celebration. Her shoes had been repaired more than once, and the sleeves of her dress had been carefully mended by her own hands. She had expected to stand quietly among the crowd for only a few minutes before returning home to care for her aging father. Instead, every eye in the kingdom was now fixed on her. Across the polished marble floor, Prince Ethan Ashford slowly rose from his seat beside Queen Eleanor. There was no smile on his face. His expression carried the weight of someone whose heart had been changed forever. The room held its breath as he stepped down from the royal platform, crossed the long aisle, and stopped only a few feet away from Grace. For several long moments, he simply looked at her. She searched his face, confused by the attention, completely unaware that the next few words would alter the course of her life forever. Then the prince spoke with a calm voice that carried to every corner of the palace.
Many of you laughed at this woman. Many of you believed she had wasted her kindness on a man who owned nothing. You saw an exhausted stranger in worn-out clothes. She saw a human being worthy of compassion. Today, before this entire kingdom, I will honor the woman who never asked for a reward.
A wave of disbelief swept across the hall. Grace's eyes filled with tears before she could even understand what he truly meant. Then Prince Ethan reached for her trembling hand and said,
"This is the woman everyone called foolish for helping a homeless man. Today, she becomes my queen."
The silence that followed seemed endless. Several guests gasped aloud. Others stood completely still, unable to believe that the quiet woman they had ignored for months had just been chosen to stand beside the future king of Westhaven. Queen Eleanor watched with moist eyes, remembering every conversation, every disagreement, and every sleepless night that had led to this unforgettable moment. She had questioned her son's judgment. She had feared he would embarrass the royal family. She had wondered whether his unusual plan would end in heartbreak instead of hope. Yet standing before her now was undeniable proof that true character often appears where very few people choose to look. Grace herself seemed unable to move. She looked down at the prince's hand holding hers, then back at his face, searching for an explanation that her heart had not yet found. Around them, whispers filled the magnificent hall like a rising tide. Everyone wanted the same answer. How could an ordinary woman from the edge of the kingdom become the future queen? To understand that answer, we have to return 3 months earlier, long before the celebration, before the applause, before the royal announcement, to a time when Prince Ethan Ashford possessed everything a man could desire except the one thing he valued most. Every newspaper praised him. Every portrait painted him as the perfect future king. Every noble family hoped their daughter would capture his attention. Yet the closer people tried to move toward the crown, the farther they drifted from the man who wore it. Ethan had spent years smiling through elegant banquets, royal ceremonies, and carefully arranged introductions, but with every passing season, one question refused to leave his heart. If the crown disappeared tomorrow, would anyone still choose him? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As spring settled over the kingdom of Westhaven, preparations for the prince's future marriage quietly became the most discussed subject in every village, every marketplace, and every grand estate across the realm. Mothers dreamed aloud of seeing their daughters become royalty. Young women imagined life inside the palace walls. Matchmakers confidently predicted that Prince Ethan would soon announce his engagement to one of the kingdom's most admired ladies. To everyone watching from the outside, his future looked flawless. What no one realized was that the prince had already reached a decision that would place his title, his reputation, and even his own heart on a path no member of the royal family had ever dared to follow. 3 months before the unforgettable ceremony that would leave the entire kingdom of Westhaven speechless, life inside the royal palace appeared almost perfect. Every morning, newspapers praised Prince Ethan Ashford as the future every kingdom wished it had. Portrait artists competed for the honor of painting his likeness, and their work hung proudly in homes, businesses, schools, and government buildings throughout the country. Children dressed as the young prince during harvest festivals. Veterans admired the respect he showed those who had defended the kingdom. Merchants spoke highly of his fairness whenever he visited local markets. He was educated without arrogance, disciplined without cruelty, generous without seeking attention, and confident without making others feel small. Wherever he appeared, people smiled. Wherever he traveled, crowds gathered. To millions across Westhaven, Prince Ethan Ashford seemed to possess the kind of life most people could only imagine. The admiration surrounding Prince Ethan only continued to grow as the years passed. Every public appearance became front-page news. Every charity event attracted record attendance. Mothers quietly dreamed that one day their daughters might somehow capture the prince's attention, while fathers joked that winning the prince's approval would be more valuable than inheriting a fortune. Across the kingdom, young women collected newspaper photographs of Ethan, carefully placing them inside journals beside handwritten wishes they rarely shared with anyone else. Tailors designed gowns inspired by fashions worn during royal celebrations, hoping their clients might one day wear them to the palace. Social gatherings often ended with the same conversation. Has the prince chosen a bride yet? It became the question people asked almost as frequently as they discussed the weather. Entire businesses quietly flourished because of the kingdom's growing excitement over the future royal wedding. Jewelers prepared engagement collections years in advance. Bakers experimented with elaborate wedding cakes they hoped the palace would one day order. Even musicians composed grand ceremonial pieces without knowing whether they would ever be performed. Inside the palace, however, those celebrations felt strangely distant from the man at the center of everyone's attention. While the kingdom imagined a fairy tale future, Ethan often found himself standing alone on the palace balcony long after official dinners had ended. From there, he could see the lights of Westhaven stretching far into the distance. He loved his people deeply and never took their admiration for granted. Yet the quiet moments after each royal event left him asking questions that no ceremony could answer. He had shaken thousands of hands, listened to countless compliments, and smiled for more photographs than he could remember. Yet when the applause faded and the guests returned home, an unexpected emptiness always remained. The palace was magnificent, but its grand halls often echoed with a silence that reminded him how isolated a royal life could become. Surrounded by servants, advisors, guards, and dignitaries, he sometimes felt more alone than people living in the smallest cottages across the kingdom. Marriage proposals arrived almost daily. Some came from noble families whose influence reached back hundreds of years. Others arrived from wealthy business leaders hoping to unite their fortunes with the royal household. Distinguished politicians quietly introduced accomplished daughters during formal receptions, while respected families from neighboring kingdoms requested audiences with Queen Eleanor Ashford to discuss possible alliances. Beautiful handwritten letters decorated with elegant wax seals filled entire cabinets inside the palace archives. Portraits of remarkable young women arrived from every corner of the kingdom, each accompanied by glowing descriptions of their character, education, accomplishments, and family history. Palace staff sorted and cataloged every proposal with extraordinary care, believing the prince would surely begin reviewing them soon. Yet week after week, those carefully prepared files remained untouched. Ethan understood that many of the women being introduced were genuinely kind and accomplished, but every proposal seemed to begin with one undeniable fact. Before anyone learned what kind of man he truly was, they had already fallen in love with the idea of marrying a prince. That realization stayed with him far longer than he admitted to anyone. During official banquets, Ethan noticed how conversations subtly changed whenever people addressed him. Every compliment seemed unusually polished. Every opinion carefully agreed with his own. Every joke received louder laughter than it deserved. It became increasingly difficult to know whether he was seeing people's authentic personalities or carefully prepared performances designed to impress the future king. The more attention he received, the more uncertain he became about its true source. Did they admire his compassion or simply his position? Would they still listen if he wore ordinary clothes instead of royal attire? Would they still respect him if he arrived without guards, titles, or wealth? The questions quietly followed him through every public appearance until they became impossible to ignore. Ethan did not fear rejection nearly as much as he feared living an entire lifetime without discovering whether someone could genuinely love the man beneath the crown. One evening, after another formal reception where dozens of eligible women had been introduced with perfect manners and carefully rehearsed conversations, Prince Ethan returned alone to his private study. The room was filled with gifts presented by foreign dignitaries, books collected from around the world, and medals honoring generations of West Haven's rulers. Any visitor would have seen a life overflowing with privilege. Ethan saw something entirely different. He saw a future that could easily become built upon uncertainty. Standing before the large window overlooking the palace gardens, he finally reached a decision that had been forming quietly inside his heart for months. If everyone insisted on treating him like a prince, then perhaps the only way to discover the truth was to stop looking like one. He turned away from the window with a calm determination that surprised even himself. The following morning, he requested a private meeting with Queen Eleanor Ashford. What he asked of her would leave even his own mother wondering whether her son had completely lost his senses. The following morning, the royal breakfast table looked much as it always had. Fresh flowers decorated the center of the polished oak table. Sunlight streamed through the tall palace windows, and servants moved quietly from one end of the room to the other, filling crystal glasses and arranging silver trays with practiced precision. Yet beneath the appearance of calm, an important conversation was waiting to unfold. Queen Eleanor Ashford watched her son from across the table as he absent-mindedly stirred his tea without taking a single sip. She had noticed a change in him for months. The laughter that once came so naturally had become rare. His smiles had become careful, offered more out of duty than happiness. He still carried himself with the confidence expected of a future king, but a mother rarely misses the burdens her child tries to hide. When the servants quietly withdrew from the room, leaving only the royal family behind, Queen Eleanor folded her hands together and finally spoke.
Ethan, the kingdom has waited patiently. Every season brings more questions. Your people deserve to know who will one day stand beside their future king.
Prince Ethan slowly looked up from his untouched tea, already knowing where the conversation was leading. He had heard different versions of it countless times, but this morning felt different. There was a quiet determination in his mother's voice that suggested she had already made up her mind. Later that afternoon, Queen Eleanor summoned two of the people she trusted most. The first was Lord William Harrington, the kingdom's senior royal advisor, a thoughtful man whose wisdom had guided 3 generations of monarchs through moments of uncertainty. The second was Margaret Whitmore, West Haven's most respected royal matchmaker. Margaret possessed an extraordinary reputation for introducing couples whose marriages strengthened not only families but entire regions of the kingdom. Thick leather journals filled, with detailed notes rested under her arm wherever she traveled. Inside those journals were carefully organized records of every eligible noblewoman in West Haven. Their family histories, education, charitable work, accomplishments, talents, and reputations had all been documented over many years. If anyone believed they could find the perfect future queen, it was Margaret Whitmore. As the 3 gathered inside the Queen Mother's private council chamber, Queen Eleanor explained her concerns with quiet honesty.
My son deserves happiness, but the kingdom also deserves stability. We must help him find both.
Margaret Whitmore smiled with the confidence that had earned her admiration throughout the kingdom. She carefully opened one of her journals across the polished conference table, revealing page after page of neatly written names. Beside each name were handwritten observations collected over many years. Some women were praised for their intelligence. Others were celebrated for their charity, diplomacy, artistic gifts, or leadership within their communities. Lord William studied the pages with interest while Queen Eleanor listened attentively as Margaret outlined her proposal. Rather than arranging one formal introduction, she suggested organizing a carefully planned series of private blind dates. Each meeting would take place away from public attention, allowing Prince Ethan to speak naturally with each woman without the pressure of royal ceremonies or eager spectators. The women themselves would know they had been invited to meet the prince, but every encounter would remain confidential until Ethan himself chose someone worthy of becoming his wife. It seemed like the perfect compromise between royal tradition and personal choice. Queen Eleanor allowed herself the smallest smile in weeks. For the first time, she believed a solution might finally be within reach. When Prince Ethan entered the council chamber later that evening, Margaret Whitmore stood and greeted him warmly before presenting the beautifully bound journals. She explained the plan with enthusiasm, describing the remarkable women whose names filled each page. There were accomplished scholars, gifted musicians, respected philanthropists, successful business owners, decorated military officers' daughters, physicians, teachers, and women whose families had faithfully served West Haven for generations. Margaret spoke with genuine admiration for each candidate, believing any one of them could become an exceptional queen. Queen Eleanor watched her son's face carefully, hoping to see even the slightest spark of curiosity. Instead, his expression remained unchanged. He slowly turned several pages, studying the names and portraits without speaking. The room became noticeably quieter with every passing second. Finally, Ethan gently closed the journal and rested both hands upon its cover. He looked first at Margaret, then at Lord William, and finally at his mother. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable disappointment within it.
These women may all be wonderful, but every meeting begins with the same problem. Before they ever meet me, they already know they are meeting a prince.
No one interrupted him. Queen Eleanor sensed there was more her son had wanted to say for a very long time. Ethan slowly stood and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, where dozens of visitors admired the royal grounds below.
Every smile I receive carries a question I cannot answer. Do they admire me? Or the life they imagine I can give them? Every conversation feels rehearsed.
This evening,
Every compliment sounds carefully chosen.
Oh, you're
and every laugh arrives exactly when it should.
I have attended enough royal dinners.
To recognize when someone is speaking to the crown instead of the man wearing it. I don't want another performance.
The words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Margaret Whitmore lowered her eyes. Lord William leaned back thoughtfully. Even Queen Eleanor found herself searching for an answer she did not have. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Lord William carefully cleared his throat.
Your Highness, every future monarch faces this challenge. It is simply the price of wearing a crown.
Ethan nodded respectfully, acknowledging the wisdom in the older man's experience.
Perhaps. But if I accept that answer without question, I may spend the rest of my life wondering whether anyone ever truly knew me.
Queen Eleanor rose from her chair and walked toward her son. Her voice softened with concern.
Then tell us what you believe should happen instead.
Ethan had clearly thought about that question many times before. He looked toward the fading sunlight outside the palace windows before answering with complete certainty. If I truly want to know someone's heart, they cannot know who I am. They cannot see the palace. They cannot see the guards. They cannot see the title. They must meet a man who appears to have nothing. Margaret looked puzzled, believing she had misunderstood him. Lord William frowned with curiosity rather than disagreement. Queen Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly as she waited for him to continue. Ethan took a slow breath before revealing the idea that had occupied his thoughts for months.
I want to disappear. Not forever. Only long enough to see how people treat someone they believe has no influence, no fortune, no future.
I want to dress like a homeless beggar and walk through my own kingdom unnoticed. If any woman shows kindness to that man, then perhaps she is someone worth knowing.
The room fell completely silent. Margaret's journal slipped slightly from her hands before she caught it. Lord William blinked several times, convinced he must have heard. Incorrectly, Queen Eleanor stared at her son in complete disbelief. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, this one had never entered her mind. It sounded reckless, unnecessary, and almost impossible. The Queen Mother slowly returned to her chair, struggling to absorb what her son had proposed. She imagined newspaper headlines, frightened palace staff, anxious citizens, and endless opportunities for something to go terribly wrong. "Ethan," she whispered, "you are asking to abandon every protection that has surrounded you since childhood. You would willingly place yourself among strangers with no royal guards announcing who you are. You could become hungry. You could be insulted. You could even place yourself in danger." Ethan met her eyes with remarkable calm. "Mother," he answered quietly, "that is exactly the point. If I never experience how ordinary people are treated, how can I promise to rule them wisely? And if I never learn whether someone can care for me without knowing my name, then every promise of love will always leave me wondering." Queen Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. Every instinct as a mother urged her to refuse. Every responsibility as queen warned her against approving such an extraordinary plan. Yet beneath all her fears, she recognized something she had not seen in her son for many months. For the first time, he was speaking with hope instead of resignation. As the evening shadows stretched across the palace floor, Queen Eleanor finally drew a slow breath and gave the smallest, most reluctant nod.
Very well. We will do this, but only under conditions we establish together.
None of them realized that this single decision would change far more than the prince's future. It would reveal the true character of an entire kingdom. Queen Ethan Ashford kept her promise, although every instinct told her she was making a decision that no mother should ever have to make. Over the next several days, only a handful of people inside the palace were trusted with the prince's extraordinary plan. Lord William Harrington supervised every detail with the precision that had made him the kingdom's most respected advisor, while Margaret Whitmore quietly postponed every meeting that had already been arranged with the noble women whose names filled her journals. To the outside world, Prince Ethan Ashford had simply withdrawn from public appearances to prepare for important matters of state. Newspapers reported that the prince was dedicating several weeks to private royal duties. The explanation satisfied the public, but inside a small chamber tucked away beneath the oldest wing of Westhaven Palace, preparations unlike anything the royal household had ever attempted were quietly underway. For the first time in his life, the future king was preparing not to look more royal, but to become someone the world would never notice. The transformation began with Ethan's appearance. The palace barber, who had trimmed the prince's hair since childhood, hesitated before lifting his scissors. Ethan gave him a reassuring nod, understanding the man's reluctance. Within minutes, the carefully styled hair that had appeared in countless royal portraits disappeared beneath an uneven, neglected cut that instantly added years to his appearance. Skilled theatrical artists, usually employed during palace festivals, carefully attached a rough beard streaked with hints of gray and shaped thick eyebrows that altered the familiar lines of his face. They darkened the skin beneath his eyes to suggest years of restless nights and constant hardship. Small scars were painted across his forehead and cheeks, while subtle discoloration around his hands created the impression of someone who had spent years working without rest. When the artist finally stepped away, even Queen Eleanor found herself staring in stunned silence. The young prince she had raised had vanished. Standing before her was a weary stranger whose face carried the quiet exhaustion of a man life had repeatedly overlooked. The clothing completed the remarkable disguise. Gone were the tailored suits, polished boots, and finely embroidered coats that had always identified Ethan as royalty. In their place came faded trousers with carefully stitched tiers along the knees, a weathered coat worn thin by imaginary winters, and a loose shirt whose frayed collar hinted at years of use. His polished leather shoes were exchanged for a pair of cracked, worn-out boots with uneven soles that forced him to shorten his stride. Dust gathered naturally along the faded fabric as attendants gently rubbed the garments against old wooden beams stored inside the palace workshops. They even added tiny patches where the clothing appeared to have been repaired by hand many times before. Ethan examined himself in the mirror without speaking. Every familiar sign of privilege had disappeared. No expensive watch remained on his wrist. No royal crest decorated his clothing. No polished appearance suggested wealth or influence. For the first time since childhood, there was nothing about his appearance that invited admiration. Lord William Harrington then introduced the final pieces of the disguise, explaining that appearance alone would never be enough. People notice movement before they notice faces, he said quietly. You must become this man completely. Ethan spent hours learning to shift his weight unevenly as he walked, gradually developing a convincing limp that appeared to result from an old injury. A simple wooden walking stick became part of his daily practice until each step looked completely natural. He practiced lowering his shoulders, avoiding direct eye contact, and speaking more softly than usual. Even the confident posture expected of a future king disappeared beneath years that seemed to exist only in imagination. Palace instructors challenged him with difficult situations, forcing him to remain in character no matter what. Questions were asked. By the end of the week, the transformation had become so complete that servants who had worked beside Ethan for years walked past him without recognition. One young maid even apologized after accidentally blocking his path, believing he was an unfamiliar laborer delivering supplies to the palace. Ethan glanced toward Lord William, who simply nodded. The disguise had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Before sunrise the following morning, Prince Ethan Ashford quietly left Westhaven Palace through a small service entrance rarely used by members of the royal household. Only Queen Eleanor, Lord William Harrington, and two trusted security officers watched him disappear into the quiet streets before dawn. Hidden several blocks away, the officers had been instructed never to interfere unless his safety truly depended upon it. Ethan carried only a small cloth bag containing a loaf of bread, a water flask, and a few ordinary coins. For the first time in his life, no royal carriage followed behind him. No guards walked beside him. No citizens bowed as he passed. The palace faded into the distance until it disappeared completely from view. Standing alone beneath the cool morning sky, Ethan realized that every advantage he had known since birth had suddenly vanished. He was no longer Prince Ethan Ashford. To everyone around him, he was simply another homeless man trying to make his way through the kingdom. The first hours felt strangely peaceful. People hurried through the streets on their way to work, paying him little attention. Ethan quietly observed conversations he had never before been allowed to overhear. Merchants complained about rising prices. Parents walked children toward school while discussing ordinary family concerns. Friends laughed together over breakfast outside neighborhood cafes. It was a side of Westhaven that royal ceremonies never revealed. For a brief moment, Ethan believed his plan might actually work better than he had imagined. Then everything began to change. A group of schoolchildren spotted him sitting quietly near a public fountain while adjusting the strap on his worn cloth bag. One child pointed toward Ethan before whispering something that quickly spread through the group. Laughter followed almost immediately. Another child exaggerated Ethan's limp while the others laughed louder. A little girl covered her nose dramatically before hurrying past. None of the children recognized the man they had once cheered for during royal parades. Ethan forced himself to remain seated, reminding himself that revealing his identity would defeat the purpose of the journey. Still, their laughter lingered far longer than he expected. It was the first time in his life that anyone had looked at him with open ridicule. As the day continued, the differences became even harder to ignore. Ethan entered a small bakery, hoping to purchase a simple roll with the coins in his pocket. The shopkeeper barely looked at him before announcing that everything had already been sold, despite fresh bread sitting plainly on the shelves behind the counter. Moments later, a well-dressed customer entered, and the same shopkeeper greeted him with a broad smile before happily offering several warm loaves. Ethan quietly thanked the man anyway and stepped back onto the street. At another shop, customers shifted their baskets closer whenever he walked nearby. A woman gently pulled her young son to the opposite side of the sidewalk without saying a word. Two businessmen ended their conversation the moment Ethan approached, waiting until he had passed before continuing. It wasn't anger he saw on their faces. It was something that felt even colder. Most people simply acted as though he didn't exist. The prince had imagined being treated differently, but he had never imagined becoming invisible. As evening settled across West Haven, Ethan lowered himself onto a weathered bench overlooking the town square. The sounds of laughter drifted from nearby restaurants where families gathered for dinner, while musicians entertained visitors beneath glowing street lanterns. Only a few days earlier, those same streets would have welcomed him with applause, eager smiles, and respectful greetings. Now hundreds of people walked within a few feet of him without offering so much as a glance. For the first time since leaving the palace, Ethan felt the true weight of his decision pressing against his heart. The disguise had hidden far more than his title. It had hidden his value in the eyes of many who judged him before a single word had been spoken. As darkness slowly covered the streets of West Haven, Prince Ethan Ashford realized that his search for genuine love had unexpectedly become something much deeper. He was about to discover what life looked like for countless ordinary people whose stories were never noticed. And before this journey could lead him to Grace Carter, the prince was about to learn his first painful lesson. The first week passed more quickly than Prince Ethan Ashford expected, though each day seemed to leave a deeper mark on his understanding of the kingdom he would one day rule. Every evening, after quietly returning to a secure location arranged by Lord William Harrington, he recorded everything he had seen inside a small leather journal. He wrote about the elderly veteran ignored outside a crowded train station, the exhausted mother who shared her last piece of bread with a stranger while wealthier citizens hurried past without noticing either of them, and the countless moments when appearances determined how people were treated before a single word had been exchanged. Yet despite everything he had learned, Ethan reminded himself that his original purpose had not changed. He still wanted to discover whether genuine affection could exist beyond wealth, titles, and royal privilege. Queen Eleanor Ashford, though still uneasy about the entire experiment, reluctantly agreed that the first carefully arranged meeting should proceed. Margaret Whitmore selected a young woman whose beauty and reputation had become the subject of conversation throughout West Haven. Her name was Victoria Langford, the daughter of one of the kingdom's most successful investment families. Newspapers regularly described her as graceful, sophisticated, and remarkably accomplished. Many people quietly predicted that she would become the future queen of West Haven. Margaret Whitmore carefully designed the meeting so that Victoria would believe she was attending another private evaluation arranged by the royal household before eventually meeting Prince Ethan under more formal circumstances. She was told that an advisor connected to the palace wished to observe her kindness, patience, and ability to communicate with ordinary citizens before introducing her to the prince himself. Victoria welcomed the invitation with complete confidence. Friends later recalled how excited she had been while preparing for the occasion. She purchased an elegant designer dress, selected expensive jewelry that reflected her family's success without appearing excessive, and practiced answers to questions she imagined the royal family might ask. She spent hours rehearsing conversations about charity, leadership, education, and diplomacy, believing every sentence might influence her future. She had prepared herself to impress a prince. What she did not know was that her first meeting would take place with the very man she hoped to marry, though she would see only a homeless stranger standing in her path. The meeting was arranged inside one of West Haven's most beautiful public gardens, where citizens from every part of the kingdom often gathered to enjoy peaceful afternoons. Margaret believed the setting would feel natural while allowing trusted palace observers to remain unnoticed from a distance. Ethan arrived early, dressed exactly as he had been throughout the previous week. His worn coat carried fresh traces of dust from the roadside. His patched trousers appeared even older beneath the afternoon sunlight, and his weathered boots looked as though they had survived years of hardship. Leaning gently on his wooden walking stick, he quietly took his place beside a stone fountain where visitors frequently rested before continuing through the gardens. Hidden among the crowd, Lord William Harrington and several discreet security officers watched carefully, prepared to intervene only if genuine danger arose. Queen Eleanor had insisted upon that condition, even though Ethan had repeatedly assured her it would never be necessary. Victoria Langford arrived precisely on time. Her elegant appearance immediately attracted admiring glances from nearby visitors. She walked confidently along the garden path, her posture reflecting years of refinement and privilege. Ethan observed her quietly before lowering his eyes, determined to remain fully committed to his role. As Victoria approached the fountain, Ethan gently stepped forward and spoke in a polite voice barely above a whisper. He explained that he had not eaten since the previous day and asked whether she might spare enough money to purchase a simple meal from the nearby bakery. His request lasted only a few seconds. He demanded nothing. He reached toward her with neither desperation nor entitlement. He simply hoped to see how someone who believed herself worthy of becoming queen would respond to a stranger whose only visible possession was a worn cloth bag hanging from one shoulder. Victoria stopped walking and slowly looked Ethan up and down. For several uncomfortable seconds, she said nothing. Her expression revealed neither compassion nor curiosity. Instead, it carried the unmistakable discomfort of someone irritated that an unexpected interruption had disturbed an otherwise pleasant afternoon. She took one cautious step backward, carefully creating more distance between herself and the man standing before her. Her eyes lingered on his torn clothing before settling on his untrimmed beard. Finally, she spoke with a calm voice that nevertheless carried enough sharpness to leave little doubt about her opinion. She suggested that someone who truly wanted to improve his circumstances should spend less time asking strangers for assistance and more time finding honest work. Without waiting for Ethan to respond, she reached into her handbag, not to offer help, but to remove a small bottle of hand sanitizer, quietly cleaning her hands after adjusting the strap of her purse where she believed he might have brushed against it. Ethan remained completely still. He had prepared himself for rejection, yet hearing those words face to face carried a weight he had not expected. Before he could quietly thank her for her time, Victoria glanced toward a nearby cafe where several well-dressed guests had begun recognizing her. Her expression immediately brightened as she smiled warmly and waved in their direction. The contrast struck Ethan almost instantly. The kindness absent only moments earlier appeared effortlessly whenever someone of influence entered her view. She briefly looked back at Ethan and added one final remark, suggesting that people often remain poor because they lacked ambition rather than opportunity. Then, with graceful confidence, she turned away and continued toward the cafe without another glance. Within moments, she disappeared into cheerful conversation, laughing comfortably among people whose clothing reflected the same wealth and status she valued so highly. From his position across the garden, Lord William Harrington quietly lowered the notebook in which he had been recording every detail of the encounter. Even he seemed saddened by how quickly the meeting had revealed what Prince Ethan had feared all along. There had been no attempt to understand the man before her, no simple question asking whether he was safe, no acknowledgement that hardship could visit anyone without warning. Ethan slowly sat back down beside the fountain, watching the ripples move gently across the water. He found himself wondering how many people like Victoria cross paths every day with men and women whose entire worth had been reduced to their appearance. She had spent weeks preparing to become a queen, Yet in the one unscripted moment that truly revealed her character, she had measured another person's value almost entirely by the condition of his clothing and the size of his wallet. As the afternoon shadows stretched across the gardens, Ethan quietly stood and adjusted the strap of his worn cloth bag. His disappointment was genuine, but it did not come from being insulted. It came from realizing how easily appearances could erase compassion from even the most polished and admired individuals. Victoria Langford would likely return home believing she had handled the encounter wisely, never knowing she had just walked away from the very future she had spent years imagining. Ethan offered one final glance toward the cafe before disappearing into the busy streets of West Haven once again. His search would continue, but the first blind date had already confirmed one painful truth. Finding someone who loved the man instead of the crown might prove far more difficult than he had ever imagined. The disappointment of the first meeting remained with Prince Ethan Ashford long after he left the gardens that afternoon. It was not because Victoria Langford had rejected a homeless stranger. He had expected rejection from some people the moment he decided to abandon the comfort of palace life. What unsettled him was how quickly compassion had disappeared the instant she believed the man before her possessed nothing of value. During his walk back through the streets of West Haven, Ethan found himself watching ordinary people more carefully than ever. A construction worker shared his lunch with an elderly man sitting outside a church without asking for anything in return. A young nurse stopped to help an exhausted mother whose groceries had fallen across the sidewalk. A teenage boy patiently helped a blind musician gather the coins that had scattered across the pavement after someone accidentally knocked over his collection box. Those simple acts reminded Ethan that kindness still existed. It simply did not always appear where society expected to find it. That realization gave him enough hope to continue the experiment. The first meeting had revealed one truth, but it could not represent every woman in West Haven. 2 days later, Margaret Whitmore arrived at Lord William Harrington's private office, carrying another leather journal. Although she remained disappointed by the outcome of the first encounter, she refused to believe her years of experience had been mistaken. One person should never define an entire generation, she said thoughtfully as she opened another carefully marked page. This time, she introduced a woman named Charlotte Bennet. Unlike Victoria Langford, Charlotte's reputation rested less on family wealth and more on personal achievement. She had graduated with the highest academic honors from West Haven Royal University, had written respected articles on education and public service, and regularly delivered speeches encouraging young women to pursue leadership roles. Newspapers often described her as one of the brightest minds of her generation. She volunteered at literacy programs, supported local museums, and served on several charitable committees. Even Queen Eleanor Ashford had once remarked that Charlotte carried herself with remarkable intelligence and grace. On paper, she appeared to possess every quality expected of a future queen. Ethan listened carefully as Margaret described her accomplishments, quietly hoping this meeting would unfold differently. Unlike the first encounter in the public gardens, this meeting was arranged inside an elegant cafe overlooking one of West Haven's oldest town squares. The location had been chosen because Charlotte frequently visited the cafe after attending meetings nearby. She believed she had been invited there to discuss an educational initiative supported by members of the royal household before eventually meeting Prince Ethan Ashford on another occasion. She arrived carrying several neatly organized documents beneath one arm, greeting the cafe staff warmly as they welcomed her by name. Ethan was already seated alone near the entrance, dressed in the same worn clothing that had now become almost second nature. His beard remained unkempt, dust covered the sleeves of his faded coat, and his wooden walking stick rested quietly against the side of his chair. He ordered nothing more than a cup of water, careful not to attract unnecessary attention. Hidden among the other guests, Lord William observed from a distant table, while trusted palace officers remained scattered throughout the cafe, blending naturally into the afternoon crowd. Charlotte Bennet entered with quiet confidence. Her appearance reflected elegance without extravagance. She thanked the hostess with genuine warmth, smiled politely at the staff, and paused to hold the door open for an elderly gentleman entering behind her. Ethan noticed these small gestures immediately. Unlike his first meeting, nothing about Charlotte suggested arrogance or entitlement. She spoke respectfully, listened attentively, and carried herself with calm self-assurance. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered whether this woman might finally challenge the fears that had haunted him for months. As Charlotte waited for her reserved table near the window, Ethan slowly rose with the assistance of his walking stick and approached just close enough to speak politely. He apologized for interrupting her afternoon and explained that he hoped to purchase something warm to eat before the cafe closed. He asked whether she might be willing to spare enough money for a simple bowl of soup. Charlotte looked directly into his eyes. Instead of immediately turning away, she smiled gently and thanked him for asking politely. Her voice carried genuine kindness as she explained that she did not usually give money because she preferred supporting local organizations that help people rebuild their lives. Ethan nodded respectfully, appreciating that her answer, although disappointing, had been delivered with dignity rather than contempt. Before walking away, Charlotte even wished him well and expressed hope that his circumstances would improve. Ethan quietly thanked her, feeling a small measure of relief. Perhaps, he thought, he had judged too quickly after meeting Victoria Langford. Perhaps there were women whose compassion extended beyond polished appearances. As Charlotte settled into her seat by the window, Ethan returned to his own table believing the afternoon had offered the first encouraging sign since beginning his journey. Several minutes later, while Charlotte reviewed documents spread neatly across her table, a waiter approached to take her lunch order. Ethan happened to be close enough to hear their conversation without appearing to listen. At first, Charlotte thanked the waiter warmly for his service and complimented the cafe's excellent reputation. Then, lowering her voice just enough to avoid attracting attention from other guests, she leaned slightly toward him. Her pleasant smile never faded as she quietly glanced in Ethan's direction.
Would you mind removing that filthy man from the cafe? He's making the atmosphere uncomfortable.
I understand you may be trying to help him, but customers shouldn't have to eat while someone like that is sitting only a few tables away.
The waiter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. Please be discreet. I simply don't think he belongs in a place like this.
Yes, madame.
For several long seconds, Ethan remained perfectly still. Those few words settled over him with far greater weight than Victoria Langford's open rejection. Charlotte had spoken kindly to his face. She had smiled with warmth, maintained flawless manners, and displayed every outward sign of compassion. Yet the moment she believed he could no longer hear her, she had revealed a very different opinion. It was not the request itself that wounded him most. It was the realization that kindness could sometimes become another performance, carefully displayed whenever others were watching. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes toward the untouched glass of water before him, suddenly questioning how many polished conversations he had experienced over the years had concealed similar thoughts beneath courteous smiles. The waiter stood uncertainly beside Charlotte's table before quietly walking toward Ethan. His expression carried visible embarrassment. "Sir," he began gently, "I'm very sorry to trouble you. Would you mind finishing your water outside? Some guests have expressed concerns." Ethan looked into the young man's face and immediately understood that he was simply trying to keep his job. There was no cruelty in his voice, only discomfort. Ethan smiled faintly, thanked him for speaking respectfully, and gathered his worn cloth bag without argument. As he walked toward the cafe door, he noticed Charlotte continuing to review her papers as though nothing unusual had happened. She never looked in his direction again. To everyone else inside the cafe, the afternoon continued peacefully. Only two people knew what had truly taken place. One was the prince who had just witnessed another carefully crafted mask fall away. The other was Lord William Harrington, who quietly closed his notebook with a heavy sigh, recognizing that Prince Ethan Ashford's search for genuine character had become even more difficult than any of them had imagined. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the familiar sounds of life across the town square. Street musicians performed cheerful melodies while families wandered between small shops and cafes, unaware that the future king stood among them carrying another invisible wand. Ethan paused beside the stone fountain at the center of the square and looked up toward the palace that could just barely be seen above the rooftops in the distance. He had begun this journey believing that wealth often hid people's true intentions. Now, he was discovering something even more unsettling. Sometimes elegance, education, and perfect manners could do the same. Charlotte Bennet had appeared to be everything a future queen should become. Yet one quiet sentence spoken to a waiter had revealed a truth no carefully written biography ever could. As Ethan adjusted the strap of his worn bag and disappeared once more into the crowded streets of West Haven, he wondered how many more disappointments his heart would have to endure before he finally found the woman who saw value in a person long before noticing the clothes they wore. By the time the third meeting was arranged, Prince Ethan Ashford had begun to understand that disappointment rarely arrived wearing the same face twice. Victoria Langford had judged him openly, allowing wealth to determine another person's worth before learning anything about his character. Charlotte Bennet had displayed impeccable manners while quietly revealing a very different opinion once she believed no one was listening. Neither encounter had left Ethan angry. Instead, they left him wondering how many people spent their lives performing kindness without ever allowing it to take root in their hearts. Even Queen Eleanor Ashford noticed the subtle change in her son during their carefully guarded evening conversations. Although Ethan never revealed the identities of the women he had met, she could hear the growing weariness in his voice. She worried that every disappointment was slowly convincing him that genuine love simply did not exist. Lord William Harrington, however, encouraged the prince to continue. Sometimes, the older advisor said quietly, the answers we seek arrive only after we've exhausted every reason to stop searching. Ethan carried those words with him as Margaret Whitmore prepared the next introduction. This time, Margaret seemed genuinely optimistic. She placed another profile on the polished table inside Lord William's office and smiled before speaking. Her name is Amelia Brooks, she said. She may surprise you. Unlike the previous candidates, Amelia had not been raised among old aristocratic families. Her parents had built a successful publishing company through decades of hard work, giving their daughter a comfortable life while teaching her the value of education and determination. Amelia quickly became known throughout West Haven for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and remarkable ability to make complete strangers feel at ease. She volunteered at community theaters, organized reading programs for children, and possessed a natural confidence that made people enjoy her company almost immediately. Friends often described her as someone who could brighten an entire room simply by walking into it. Margaret admitted that Amelia did not always follow strict royal etiquette, but she believed her authenticity might be exactly what Prince Ethan had been searching for. As Ethan listened, he found himself feeling hopeful for the first time in many days. The meeting took place during an outdoor community arts festival held along the riverfront, where musicians, painters, and local craftsmen gathered each spring to celebrate the creativity that had become one of West Haven's greatest sources of pride. Amelia Brooks attended the event every year, believing that the finest conversations often happened far away from formal ballrooms and expensive banquets. Ethan blended naturally into the crowd, his worn clothing attracting little attention among the busy festival visitors. Children ran between colorful displays, while musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies, creating an atmosphere that felt wonderfully ordinary. As Ethan slowly made his way along the river path with the assistance of his walking stick, he noticed Amelia laughing with a group of elderly artists who appeared completely captivated by one of her stories. Her laughter was genuine rather than rehearsed, and within moments Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. There was something refreshing about her ability to make everyone around her feel included. She did not seem concerned with impressing anyone. Instead, she simply enjoyed the people she met. Their paths crossed naturally beside a booth where volunteers were serving fresh lemonade to festival visitors. Ethan quietly stepped aside to avoid blocking the line, but Amelia noticed him almost immediately. Instead of pretending he wasn't there, she smiled warmly and jokingly remarked that, judging by his tired expression, he looked as though he deserved the first glass more than anyone else waiting. Ethan chuckled softly, surprised by how naturally the conversation began. Amelia introduced herself without hesitation and asked whether he had come to enjoy the music. Their conversation lasted several minutes, touching on books, travel, favorite childhood memories, and even the unpredictable weather that often interrupted West Haven's spring festivals. Ethan quickly realized that Amelia possessed something neither Victoria nor Charlotte had demonstrated. She knew how to make another person feel comfortable without asking who they were or what they owned. For the first time since leaving the palace, Ethan almost forgot he was wearing a disguise. He found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation, and somewhere across the festival grounds, Lord William Harrington quietly noticed the change in the prince's expression. Hope had returned to his eyes. As the afternoon continued, Amelia surprised Ethan several more times. She laughed easily at herself whenever she accidentally spilled a few drops of lemonade across the table. She listened carefully instead of interrupting, and when an elderly vendor struggled to carry several heavy boxes, she immediately paused their conversation to help without expecting praise from anyone nearby. Ethan watched these moments carefully. They were unscripted and entirely natural. Margaret Whitmore, observing from a discreet distance, allowed herself a quiet smile. Perhaps, she thought, this meeting would finally bring the prince closer to the answer he had spent months searching for. Even Ethan began wondering whether his fears had been exaggerated. Maybe genuine warmth and genuine character truly could exist together. Maybe the painful lessons of the previous meetings had simply been unfortunate exceptions. Eventually, their conversation turned toward the future. Amelia spoke enthusiastically about her ambitions, explaining that she dreamed of expanding her family's publishing company across neighboring kingdoms. She described the satisfaction of building something respected enough to leave behind for future generations. Ethan admired her determination and asked what kind of partner she hoped to share that future with. Amelia paused thoughtfully before answering. Her smile remained, but her words gradually revealed another side of her thinking. She explained that she had worked too hard to settle for an ordinary life. She admired success, influence, and social standing because they opened doors that talent alone often could not. Then, almost laughing at her own honesty, she admitted something she believed most people simply kept to themselves.
If I'm being truthful, I could never marry a man without wealth. Life is simply easier when people admire your position. I want to build a name that everyone recognizes.
I suppose there's nothing wrong with wanting status if you're honest about it.
She smiled again, believing her openness deserved appreciation. The words settled heavily in Ethan's heart. Amelia had not insulted him. She had not asked anyone to remove him. She had spoken honestly and without pretending to be someone she wasn't. Yet her honesty carried a painful truth. She viewed marriage not as a partnership built upon character, but as a pathway toward greater recognition and influence. Ethan appreciated that she had not hidden her priorities behind carefully rehearsed speeches, but he also understood that sincerity alone could not replace compassion. A truthful heart could still pursue the wrong things. He looked around the festival as families laughed together beneath colorful banners, realizing that many of the happiest people he had seen during his journey possessed very little wealth. Their joy came from one another, not from status. Amelia's dreams were understandable, but they left little room for loving someone whose greatest treasure could not be measured by money or prestige. As the afternoon drew to a close, Amelia thanked Ethan for the pleasant conversation and wished him well before joining friends waiting near the riverbank. She walked away smiling, never realizing she had spent hours speaking with the future king of West Haven. Ethan watched her disappear into the cheerful crowd before quietly turning toward the opposite end of the festival. Lord William eventually caught up with him as evening shadows stretched across the riverside paths. Neither man spoke for several moments. There was very little left to say. Ethan finally broke the silence with a thoughtful voice that carried neither bitterness nor anger.
She was honest, and I respect that. but honesty without compassion can still leave another person standing alone.
Lord William nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom hidden within the prince's disappointment. As they made their way through the fading light toward another uncertain tomorrow, neither of them realized that fate had already begun arranging an encounter unlike any that had come before. The woman who would one day stand trembling inside the grand hall of Westhaven Palace had not appeared on Margaret Whitmore's carefully prepared list. Grace Carter was about to enter the story in the most unexpected way imaginable. 3 weeks had passed since Prince Ethan Ashford had quietly walked away from the comfort of Westhaven Palace and into a life that very few people ever noticed. During those weeks, he had experienced ridicule, indifference, and carefully disguised prejudice. Each encounter had peeled away another layer of the comfortable assumptions he had carried throughout his privileged life. Yet somewhere beneath the disappointment, another realization had begun taking shape. He had started this journey believing he was searching for the woman worthy of becoming his queen. Now he found himself searching for something much larger. He wanted to understand what kind of king he needed to become. Every ignored greeting, every suspicious glance, and every closed door had shown him parts of his own kingdom that royal reports never mentioned. Westhaven remained a prosperous nation admired throughout the world, but prosperity did not always guarantee compassion. There were countless people whose quiet struggles unfolded every day without attracting attention. Ethan wondered how many of them had simply become invisible, just as he had. Unknown to him, before the sun set that very afternoon, his search was about to take an unexpected turn. The woman who would eventually stand beside him in the grand hall of Westhaven Palace had never appeared inside Margaret Whitmore's carefully organized journals. She had never attended royal banquets, never sought introductions through influential families, and had never imagined that her ordinary day would cross paths with the future king. Grace Carter's mornings began long before sunrise. While much of Westhaven still slept peacefully, she was already helping her aging father prepare their modest vegetable cart for the busy marketplace. Since the passing of her mother several years earlier, Grace had quietly assumed responsibilities that many women twice her age would have found overwhelming. Her father, Thomas Carter, had once been known throughout the district as one of the hardest-working farmers in the county. Years of labor beneath the hot summer sun had provided a comfortable life for his family, but advancing age and persistent pain in his joints had gradually stolen much of his strength. Grace never complained about the sacrifices she made to care for him. Each morning, she loaded baskets of fresh vegetables onto their weathered wooden wagon, carefully counted the day's inventory, checked that her father had taken his medicine, and walked beside him nearly 2 miles to the town market. Their small home contained few luxuries. The roof leaked during heavy rain. Several pieces of furniture had been repaired countless times, and every dollar they earned required careful planning. Still, visitors often noticed something unusual whenever they stepped inside the Carter home. It was filled with warmth that money could never purchase. Unlike many women her age, Grace had never measured success by expensive clothing or grand invitations. She owned only a handful of simple dresses, each one carefully maintained despite years of use. Every evening, she mended loose stitching by hand rather than replacing garments that still served their purpose. Her greatest joy came not from acquiring more possessions, but from knowing her father no longer had to carry heavy baskets alone. Neighbors admired her quiet determination, even though few realized how much she quietly gave away. Whenever extra vegetables remained unsold at the end of the day, Grace often delivered them to elderly residents who struggled to leave their homes. She volunteered at the small community library twice each week, reading stories to children whose parents worked late into the evening. If anyone thanked her for these acts of generosity, she usually smiled and changed the subject. She never considered kindness extraordinary. To Grace, it was simply the way people should treat one another. That particular afternoon, the marketplace bustled with its usual energy. Merchants enthusiastically called out prices to passing customers, while musicians entertained families gathered beneath colorful awnings. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the crowded streets as children darted between stalls carrying small paper bags filled with sweet pastries. Grace had just finished helping her father load the few remaining vegetables back onto their wagon after another long day of work. Thomas Carter paused to massage his aching shoulder, insisting that he could manage the heavier basket himself. Grace smiled knowingly before gently lifting it from his hands anyway.
You carried enough for one lifetime. Let me carry this one.
Thomas chuckled softly, recognizing there was little use arguing with a daughter whose determination often exceeded his own. Together, they slowly made their way toward the edge of the market, grateful that business had been good enough to cover another week's household expenses. As they passed the bakery on the corner of Market Street, Grace noticed a familiar figure seated alone on a weathered wooden bench. His worn coat was covered with dust collected from weeks of walking. His boots showed signs of countless miles traveled on uneven roads, and his tired eyes remained fixed on the ground as though trying to ignore the laughter of people passing nearby. It was Prince Ethan Ashford, though neither Grace nor her father had any reason to recognize the future king hidden beneath the remarkable disguise. Ethan had spent nearly the entire afternoon unsuccessfully searching for temporary work. 3 different shopkeepers had dismissed him before allowing him to finish speaking, while another customer had quietly suggested that he move somewhere less visible because his appearance might discourage business. Hunger had become an increasingly familiar companion during the past several days. The small loaf of bread he carried that morning had long since disappeared, leaving only an empty cloth bag resting beside him. Grace slowed her steps as she watched the exhausted stranger staring silently toward the crowded marketplace. Thomas Carter noticed his daughter hesitate and gently touched her shoulder.
Come along, you've worked hard enough today. We should get home before the rain starts.
Grace nodded, yet her eyes remained fixed on the lonely man sitting quietly beneath the bakery window. There was nothing dramatic about his appearance. He wasn't calling for attention or asking strangers for money. He simply looked tired in a way that seemed deeper than physical exhaustion. Grace glanced toward the bakery, then reached into the small purse she carried beneath her arm. Inside were the few dollars she had set aside to purchase fresh flour for the following week's baking. She paused for only a brief moment before making her decision.
Dad, would you mind waiting here for just a minute?
Of course, dear.
Thomas followed her gaze toward Ethan and smiled with quiet understanding. He had seen that familiar expression on his daughter's face many times before. Without asking another question, he nodded. Grace stepped inside the bakery and purchased a warm bowl of vegetable soup, a fresh loaf of bread, and a cup of hot tea. The baker, recognizing her as one of his regular customers, smiled as he carefully packed everything into a small basket. Moments later, she walked directly toward Ethan and stopped beside the bench. Ethan slowly looked up, expecting another request for him to move elsewhere. Instead, Grace simply placed the basket beside him with a gentle smile.
You look like you've had a long day. The soup is still hot, so you should probably eat before it gets cold.
Thank you.
Ethan immediately reached into his pocket for the few coins he still carried, assuming she expected payment. Grace noticed the gesture and shook her head almost before he could speak.
No, you don't owe me anything. Sometimes people just need a good meal.
Thank you.
There was no audience watching, no photographers nearby, no applause waiting to reward her generosity. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply saw another human being who looked hungry. Ethan stared at the basket for several seconds before quietly thanking her. After weeks of carefully observing how strangers responded to his appearance, the simplicity of Grace's kindness almost caught him off guard. She had not questioned his past. She had not asked whether he deserved help. She had not delivered a lecture about ambition or responsibility. She had not looked around to see whether anyone else was watching. She simply noticed another person's need and responded as naturally as breathing. Grace wished him a peaceful evening before returning to her father, who had patiently waited beside the wagon without interrupting her decision. Together, they continued walking toward the road leading home, discussing nothing more extraordinary than what they might plant in the garden. Before summer arrived, Ethan remained seated on the bench long after they disappeared into the distance. The warm bowl of soup rested untouched in his hands as one unexpected thought echoed through his mind. For the first time since leaving the palace, someone had treated him with kindness without asking for anything in return. Quietly, careful not to be seen, Prince Ethan Ashford stood, picked up his worn cloth bag, and began following Grace Carter from a respectful distance, determined to learn who this remarkable young woman truly was. Prince Ethan Ashford had intended to follow Grace Carter only long enough to learn her name. Instead, what began as simple curiosity quietly grew into something far more meaningful. Careful to remain unnoticed, he stayed several steps behind as Grace and her father slowly made their way through the winding streets leading toward the older part of West Haven. The elegant stone buildings surrounding the city center gradually gave way to modest cottages whose weathered walls told stories of generations who had learned to live with very little. Grace never once complained about the long walk. Even after spending the entire day helping at the market, she remained beside her father, matching her pace to his slower steps without showing the slightest impatience. Whenever the road became uneven, she gently steadied him by the arm, pretending it was for her own balance, so he would not feel embarrassed by his growing weakness. Ethan had witnessed countless noble families caring for elderly parents because servants expected them to do so. Grace required no audience. Her kindness appeared effortless, woven naturally into every ordinary moment of her day. Their small cottage stood at the end of a quiet lane, surrounded by flowering shrubs that had clearly been cared for despite limited means. The wooden fence leaned slightly from years of use, and the front porch showed signs of careful repairs completed many times rather than replaced. Nothing about the home suggested wealth, yet everything reflected love and attention. Ethan remained hidden beneath the shade of a large maple tree across the road as Grace helped Thomas Carter carry the remaining baskets inside. Before unpacking a single vegetable, she insisted that her father sit comfortably in his favorite chair while she prepared his evening meal. Through the softly lit kitchen window, Ethan watched her move with practiced confidence. She placed a warm blanket across her father's knees before serving dinner, gently reminding him to take his medicine with a glass of water. Thomas smiled gratefully, though Ethan noticed something else in the older man's eyes. It was the quiet look of a father who knew his daughter had sacrificed far more than she allowed him to see. The following morning, Ethan returned to the neighborhood before sunrise. He expected Grace to spend another day preparing vegetables for the market, but instead he watched her carefully lock the cottage door after ensuring her father had everything he needed for the morning. Carrying a worn canvas bag filled with books and notebooks, she walked toward a small community building near the edge of the village. Curious, Ethan quietly followed from a distance until he reached a modest classroom attached to an old church. One by one, children from nearby families arrived carrying pencils, notebooks, and eager smiles. Some wore neatly pressed school uniforms, while others came dressed in clothes that had clearly been handed down through older siblings. Grace greeted every child by name, kneeling to speak with the youngest students so their eyes met the same level. There was no school administrator collecting fees, no official payroll office, and no government representative overseeing the program. Ethan later learned that many of these children came from families who could not afford private tutors after school. Several years earlier, Grace had simply offered to teach them free of charge, believing no child should be denied an education because of financial hardship. For nearly 3 hours, Ethan quietly observed from outside an open window while Grace transformed the simple classroom into a place filled with laughter, curiosity, and encouragement. She celebrated every small achievement as though it were extraordinary. When one little boy struggled to read aloud, she patiently encouraged him until his confidence returned instead of allowing embarrassment to take hold. When two sisters argued over shared school supplies, Grace gently reminded them that kindness often solved problems more effectively than anger. The children listened because they trusted her, not because they feared punishment. During a short break, Ethan noticed Grace quietly opening her own canvas bag and removing several brand new notebooks along with pencils she had purchased herself. She handed them discreetly to 3 children whose parents had been unable to provide school supplies that month. None of the other students noticed what she had done. Grace clearly preferred helping people in ways that protected their dignity. Ethan found himself wondering how often acts like these happened without anyone ever hearing about them. As the days passed, Ethan continued quietly observing Grace whenever circumstances allowed. The more he watched, the more remarkable her ordinary life became. On Wednesday afternoons, she visited Mrs. Eleanor Dawson, an elderly widow whose failing eyesight made grocery shopping almost impossible. Grace cleaned the woman's kitchen, organized her medicine cabinet, and read aloud from her favorite novels before returning home. On Fridays, she stopped at a neighborhood shelter carrying baskets filled with leftover vegetables from the market. When the shelter manager apologized for accepting so much of her family's produce, Grace simply smiled and replied that vegetables served little purpose sitting unsold, while families went hungry. More than once, Ethan noticed her quietly removing a few dollars from her purse to help someone pay for medicine or bus fare, even though he knew she possessed very little money herself. Every act appeared completely natural. She never paused to consider whether anyone would notice. Helping others seemed to be as ordinary to Grace as breathing. One Saturday afternoon, while helping Thomas Carter arrange fresh vegetables outside their market stall, Grace became the subject of another familiar conversation among neighboring vendors. A pair of women standing only a few booths away lowered their voices, though not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. One remarked that Grace was becoming too old to remain unmarried, while the other suggested she had set her expectations unrealistically high despite having very little to offer wealthy suitors. Another merchant joked that kindness alone would never provide the comfortable life she deserved. Grace heard every word. Ethan saw the brief sadness pass across her face before she gently smiled and continued arranging carrots inside a wooden basket as though the comments had never been made. Thomas Carter looked ready to defend his daughter, but Grace quietly touched his arm, silently asking him to let the remarks pass without argument. Ethan admired the restraint she displayed. There was no bitterness in her response, only quiet dignity. Later that afternoon, Ethan unexpectedly learned the truth behind those whispered conversations. While purchasing apples from a neighboring vendor, he overheard 2 longtime residents discussing Grace's past. They spoke of several wealthy men who had expressed interest in marrying her over the previous few years. One owned a chain of successful businesses throughout West Haven. Another belonged to an influential political family whose fortunes stretched back generations. A third had recently inherited extensive farmland along the northern valley. By every outward measure, each proposal promised Grace financial security for the rest of her life. Yet she had politely declined every one of them. At first, many people assumed she had made a foolish mistake. As time passed, rumors suggested she secretly hoped to marry into royalty or some equally impossible future. The truth, however, was far simpler. Ethan later heard one elderly neighbor quietly explain it better than anyone else.
Grace never refused their money. She refused the way they treated people who had less than they did.
According to those who knew her well, each wealthy suitor had eventually revealed a streak of arrogance, speaking disrespectfully to waiters, dismissing laborers, or looking down upon struggling families. Grace believed a person's character mattered far more than the size of their bank account, and once she recognized pride beneath polished manners, she gently walked away without regret. That evening, Ethan remained seated alone on a hillside overlooking the village as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant fields. The warm meal Grace had purchased for him several days earlier had long since been forgotten, but the memory of her simple act of kindness continued growing stronger with each passing day. He thought about the countless women whose names filled Margaret Whitmore's elegant journals, each carefully evaluated according to education, family history, wealth, and social standing. Grace Carter possessed none of those impressive credentials. She had never attended royal banquets. She had never sought recognition from influential families. She lived in a modest cottage, spent her days caring for her widowed father, gave away money she could scarcely afford to lose, taught children without accepting payment, and quietly endured criticism from people who believed she had wasted her life. Yet without realizing it, she had demonstrated more genuine nobility than anyone Prince Ethan Ashford had met since leaving Westhaven Palace. For the first time since beginning his extraordinary journey, the prince found himself looking forward to tomorrow not because of another carefully planned test, but because he wanted to understand the remarkable woman whose compassion seemed untouched by the world's expectations. As the days turned into weeks, Prince Ethan Ashford realized that simply observing Grace Carter from a distance would never answer the question that had brought him out of Westhaven Palace in the first place. Anyone could appear compassionate when life was comfortable and nothing was being asked of them. Real character, he had learned, revealed itself when kindness became inconvenient, costly, or even risky. It was the lesson Lord William Harrington had quietly repeated throughout the prince's childhood. A person's values, the old advisor often said, are measured most clearly when they have every reason to walk away. Ethan had watched Grace care for her widowed father without complaint. He had seen her teach children for free, share food with strangers, and quietly refuse arrogant men whose wealth could have transformed her life. Yet one question remained. Would she remain the same when helping someone demanded genuine sacrifice? Ethan wrestled with the morality of testing another human being, but he reminded himself that he would never place Grace in real danger. He only wanted to create ordinary situations that many vulnerable people faced every day. If her compassion survived those moments, he would finally know it came from the deepest part of her character rather than habit or reputation. The first opportunity arrived unexpectedly at the Saturday market. Grace had just finished helping her father arrange baskets of fresh vegetables when Ethan approached their stall, his clothes carrying even more signs of hardship than before. After greeting Thomas Carter politely, he reached into his worn coat as though searching for money to buy a loaf of bread from the neighboring bakery. He checked one pocket, then another, before quietly stepping back with an embarrassed expression. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I must have lost the little money I had." He spoke with convincing disappointment, carefully allowing a few coins to remain hidden beneath the lining of his coat. Several customers waiting nearby immediately sighed with impatience. One man muttered that people like him always seemed to have an excuse. Another suggested he stop delaying honest customers if he couldn't afford to buy anything. Ethan thanked them anyway and slowly turned to leave. Before he had taken more than 3 steps, Grace called after him. Without making a grand gesture or attracting attention, she walked to the baker beside the stall, quietly paid for a fresh loaf with her own money, and placed it gently into Ethan's hands.
Everyone deserves to eat. When you're able to help someone else someday, that'll be more than enough.
She asked for nothing in return, not even his name. Ethan accepted the bread with genuine gratitude, realizing she had just spent part of the day's earnings that her family depended upon. Several days later, Ethan created another situation, one that touched even closer to the burdens Grace already carried. After spending the morning walking through the village, he sat beneath a large oak tree along the path leading from the school where Grace volunteered. This time he appeared weak, breathing heavily as though struggling with illness. His face looked pale beneath the carefully prepared makeup, and he leaned against the tree with eyes closed, convincing enough that several passers-by crossed the road rather than becoming involved. Some glanced briefly in his direction before continuing without slowing their pace. Grace spotted him as she dismissed the last of her students. She immediately hurried toward him, kneeling beside the exhausted stranger without the slightest hesitation. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Ethan mumbled that he had felt dizzy since morning and believed he had developed a fever after spending several cold nights outdoors. Grace placed the back of her hand against his forehead, genuinely concerned despite knowing nothing about him. She insisted he remain seated while she fetched water from a nearby church, then persuaded the local pharmacist to provide basic medicine after quietly paying the cost herself. Rather than simply leaving the supplies beside him, she remained until she was satisfied he seemed well enough to continue. Thomas Carter later joked that his daughter possessed enough concern to worry about the entire kingdom one person at a time. The most difficult test came several days later, though Ethan himself almost regretted arranging it. Lord William Harrington had reluctantly agreed to help stage a misunderstanding inside a busy general store, warning the prince that he should be prepared for whatever emotions followed. As Ethan quietly browsed a display near the entrance, one of Lord William's trusted assistants discreetly slipped a small silver pocket watch into the torn pocket of Ethan's coat before loudly announcing that an expensive item had disappeared from the counter. Customers immediately looked around the shop. Within moments, another assistant pretending to search nearby claimed to have discovered the missing watch inside Ethan's pocket. The shopkeeper's expression hardened instantly. Without asking a single question, he accused Ethan of attempting to steal from the store. A crowd quickly gathered around the entrance. Several people shook their heads with disappointment, while others openly mocked the homeless man standing silently at the center of the room. One customer remarked that poverty always seemed to lead people toward dishonesty. Another insisted the police should teach him a lesson before he tried stealing elsewhere. Ethan stood quietly, allowing the accusations to continue without defending himself. He wanted to see whether anyone would look beyond appearances before passing judgment. Among the gathering crowd, Grace Carter happened to be purchasing flour for her father. She recognized Ethan immediately. Her expression filled with surprise as she listened to the accusations surrounding him. Instead of accepting the crowd's conclusion, she stepped forward and calmly asked the shopkeeper whether anyone had actually seen a man take the watch. The owner admitted that no one had witnessed the theft directly, but argued that finding the watch inside Ethan's pocket proved everything. Grace remained respectful, yet firm. She gently pointed out that evidence deserved careful examination before someone was publicly condemned. She reminded everyone that mistakes could happen and that every person deserved the opportunity to explain themselves. When several customers dismissed her concerns, suggesting she was wasting sympathy on an obvious thief, Grace quietly answered, "I've met dishonest people wearing expensive suits and honest people wearing worn-out coats. Clothes don't tell us who someone is." Her words silenced the room far more effectively than raised voices ever could. Lord William, observing unnoticed from the back of the store, felt a quiet lump rise in his throat. The staged misunderstanding ended only after the shopkeeper reluctantly admitted that another employee had suddenly remembered placing the watch in the wrong location earlier that morning. The crowd slowly dispersed, some looking embarrassed while others walked away without acknowledging how quickly they had judged a complete stranger. Grace turned toward Ethan with a gentle smile and apologized for what had happened. Even though she had done nothing wrong herself, she brushed a little dust from the sleeve of his worn coat before handing him a small cloth containing fresh bread and fruit she had intended to take home for lunch. "No one should have to go through something like that alone," she said quietly. Ethan struggled to answer. During the entire journey, countless people had spoken about kindness. Grace had simply lived it, even when doing so risked criticism from everyone around her. As Ethan's admiration for Grace continued growing, events inside West Haven Palace began moving in an entirely different direction. News that Prince Ethan Ashford remained unmarried despite months of private meetings quietly spread throughout noble society. Although no one knew the prince had disappeared beneath the disguise of a homeless man, rumors suggested that the royal family had resumed searching for suitable candidates. Almost overnight, families who had previously shown only modest interest suddenly renewed their enthusiasm. Elaborate invitations once again arrived at the palace gates. Wealthy fathers praised their daughters' accomplishments more passionately than ever. Lavish charity events appeared across the kingdom, many organized by people who hoped their generosity would somehow reach the ears of Queen Eleanor Ashford. Margaret Whitmore watched the sudden surge of attention with growing disappointment. She recognized several familiar names among the invitations, including women who had shown little interest after earlier introductions had failed. Victoria Langford hosted an extravagant fundraising gala, making certain that reporters from every major newspaper attended. Charlotte Bennett published thoughtful essays praising the importance of compassion and public service, though Lord William privately wondered whether her recent experience at the cafe had influenced the carefully chosen language. Amelia Brooks openly joked among friends that perhaps destiny simply required another opportunity. Each woman presented herself as an ideal future queen, yet Ethan, still living among ordinary people, now understood something he could never have recognized from inside the palace. True character was not measured by speeches delivered beneath crystal chandeliers or photographs taken beside generous donations. It appeared quietly when no reward was expected, when helping another person offered no advantage, and when compassion became inconvenient. Every carefully planned gesture unfolding within royal society only strengthened the contrast with Grace Carter, who remained completely unaware that the future king was observing every ordinary act of kindness she offered without expecting anyone to notice. Ethan knew his extraordinary journey was approaching its conclusion. One final decision remained, and it would determine not only whom he would marry, but the kind of king the people of West Haven would one day receive. The morning after the incident at the general store, Prince Ethan Ashford returned quietly to West Haven Palace beneath the cover of darkness for the first time in several weeks. Although his disguise remained intact until the heavy palace doors closed behind him, Queen Eleanor Ashford immediately recognized the change in her son's eyes. He looked physically exhausted, yet there was a peace about him she had not seen in many months. Lord William Harrington stood nearby as Ethan slowly removed the worn coat, the faded boots, the false beard, and finally the carefully crafted disguise that had allowed him to walk unnoticed through his own kingdom. For several long moments, no one spoke. Queen Eleanor simply embraced her son, relieved that he had returned safely. When she finally stepped back, she studied his face carefully before asking the question that had occupied her thoughts since the day he first proposed the extraordinary experiment.
Did you find what you were looking for?
Ethan remained silent for a moment before answering with
You were
complete
looking for?
certainty.
No, Mother, I found far more than I ever expected.
Over the following days, Prince Ethan recounted every detail of his journey. He spoke of the children who laughed at a homeless stranger because no one had taught them to look beyond appearances. He described the shopkeepers who dismissed struggling people before hearing a single word they had to say. He shared the painful encounters with Victoria Langford, Charlotte Bennett, and Amelia Brooks, each one revealing a different lesson about character, ambition, and compassion. Queen Eleanor listened without interrupting, often lowering her eyes as she realized how little even the palace understood about the lives of ordinary citizens. When Ethan finally began speaking about Grace Carter, however, something changed. His voice carried neither excitement nor infatuation. Instead, it reflected deep admiration. He described the warm meal she had quietly purchased for a complete stranger, the way she cared for her widowed father without seeking praise, the afternoons she spent teaching children whose families could not afford private lessons, and the countless acts of generosity she offered without expecting recognition. By the time he finished, even Margaret Whitmore sat quietly wiping tears from her eyes. Every carefully prepared journal she had spent years compiling suddenly seemed incomplete. None of them had contained the name Grace Carter. Queen Eleanor walked slowly toward the palace window, overlooking the city. After a long silence, she turned back toward her son with a thoughtful expression. "If Grace Carter is truly the woman you believe her to be," she said gently, "then the kingdom deserves to witness the truth for itself. This decision cannot simply be announced. It must be understood." Lord William Harrington nodded in agreement. 4 generations. Royal marriages had strengthened political alliances and united influential families. This marriage would do something far more important. It would remind the people of West Haven that true nobility was measured by character rather than privilege. After several hours of careful discussion, the Royal Council agreed upon a final plan. A formal announcement would be delivered throughout the kingdom. Every woman who had participated in the royal selection process would receive a personal invitation to attend a special ceremony inside the Grand Hall of Westhaven Palace. The invitation would simply state that Prince Ethan Ashford was prepared to reveal the conclusion of his search for a future queen. Curiosity spread through the kingdom almost immediately. Newspapers printed special editions before sunset. Merchants discussed the announcement with customers. Families gathered around dinner tables trying to predict which noblewoman would soon wear the royal crown. Victoria Langford received her invitation with visible excitement. She immediately instructed her household staff to prepare several elegant gowns before deciding which one would make the strongest impression. She quietly convinced herself that the prince had surely recognized the confidence she displayed during their earlier encounter. Charlotte Bennet accepted her invitation with composed optimism, believing that perhaps the prince valued intelligence enough to overlook any misunderstandings from the past. Amelia Brooks laughed when the letter arrived, joking with friends that destiny clearly enjoyed surprising people. Across Westhaven, dozens of women carefully prepared for what many believed would become the most important day of their lives. Jewelers worked late into the evening adjusting necklaces and bracelets. Dressmakers rushed to complete final alterations. Carriages were polished until they reflected the afternoon sunlight. Every invited guest imagined walking into the palace, believing she might soon become the future queen of Westhaven. Meanwhile, several miles away in the quiet village where Grace Carter lived, an exhausted royal courier rode slowly down the narrow country road, carrying one final sealed envelope bearing the royal crest. Lord William Harrington had personally added Grace's name to the official guest list before the invitations were delivered. The courier stopped outside the modest Carter cottage and knocked gently upon the weathered wooden door. Grace answered with flour, still lightly dusting her hands after spending the morning baking bread for her father. The courier respectfully handed her the envelope before riding away without explanation. Grace stared at the elegant seal for several moments before carefully opening the letter. As her eyes moved across the beautifully written invitation, confusion gradually replaced curiosity. She quietly read the message a second time, convinced she had misunderstood. According to the letter, she had been formally invited to attend the royal gathering inside Westhaven Palace alongside the women who had participated in Prince Ethan Ashford's search for future bride. Grace immediately shook her head in disbelief.
There must be some mistake.
She had never attended a royal banquet. She had never met the prince. She certainly had never taken part in any royal courtship. She assumed the invitation had been delivered to the wrong address. That evening, Grace showed the letter to Thomas Carter while serving him supper. Her father adjusted his glasses and carefully read every line before smiling warmly. "I've lived long enough to know that mistakes happen," he admitted. "But I've also lived long enough to know that opportunities sometimes arrive wearing unusual clothes." Grace laughed softly, insisting the palace would surely correct the error as soon as she contacted them. "Imagine me walking into a room filled with nobles," she said with amused embarrassment. "I'd probably be asked to leave before I even reached the front door." Thomas gently folded the invitation and placed it back into her hands. "Whether it's a mistake or not," he replied quietly, "someone believed you deserved to receive it. Perhaps you should honor that invitation." Grace remained uncertain. She could not imagine standing among wealthy families wearing the simple dresses hanging inside her modest wardrobe. News of the invitation quickly spread through the neighborhood after one of the local children excitedly mentioned seeing the royal courier outside the Carter home. Before long, several neighbors stopped by to congratulate Grace despite her repeated insistence that the palace had made an error. Mrs. Eleanor Dawson, the elderly widow Grace visited every Wednesday, smiled knowingly as she listened to Grace's doubts. "You've spent years showing up for everyone else," she said. "Perhaps it's time to let life show up for you." Another neighbor quietly disappeared for several minutes before returning with a carefully preserved blue dress that had belonged to her daughter before she married and moved overseas. Although elegant, It remained simple enough that Grace reluctantly agreed to try it on. Others offered to adjust the sleeves, polish a pair of shoes, and carefully style her hair on the morning of the ceremony. Grace protested that everyone was making far too much effort over what was almost certainly a misunderstanding, but no one seemed interested in listening. They simply smiled and continued helping. Late that night, after her father had gone to bed, Grace stood alone before the small mirror hanging in her bedroom. The borrowed dress fit surprisingly well after several neighbors had carefully altered it by hand. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Yet instead of feeling excitement, she felt only uncertainty. "What if they tell me I don't belong there?" she whispered to herself. She folded the royal invitation once more and placed it carefully beside the family photograph of her late mother before blowing out the candle. Across the kingdom, wealthy families drifted to sleep dreaming of crowns, titles, and royal weddings. Grace Carter fell asleep, wondering only how she could politely apologize when the palace realized they had invited the wrong woman. Unknown to her, inside Westhaven Palace, Prince Ethan Ashford stood quietly in the grand hall where they would soon meet again. Looking across the magnificent room, he remembered the tired homeless man sitting alone on a market bench and an ordinary young woman who had simply offered him a warm meal without expecting anything in return. In less than 24 hours, those two worlds would finally collide, and nothing in the kingdom of Westhaven would ever be the same again. The morning of the royal ceremony arrived beneath clear blue skies, yet an unusual feeling of anticipation settled over the kingdom of Westhaven long before the palace gates opened. From every corner of the capital, elegant carriages rolled toward Westhaven Palace, carrying distinguished guests dressed in their finest attire. Noble families stepped on a polished marble walkways beneath rows of royal banners fluttering gently in the morning breeze. Members of parliament, military commanders, respected clergy, foreign ambassadors, successful merchants, and influential citizens filled the magnificent grand hall one row at a time until scarcely an empty seat remained. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room with warm golden light, while a royal orchestra performed softly in the background. Quiet conversations echoed beneath the towering ceilings as everyone tried to predict which woman would soon stand beside Prince Ethan Ashford as the future queen of Westhaven. Victoria Langford arrived, wearing an exquisite silver gown, convinced that today's ceremony might finally reward her patience. Charlotte Bennet carried herself with composed confidence, greeting familiar faces with gracious smiles. Amelia Brooks entered with her usual warmth, though even she seemed unable to hide her curiosity. Across the room, Grace Carter hesitated near the entrance, feeling painfully out of place among so much elegance. The borrowed blue dress fit beautifully after her neighbors had carefully altered it, but she remained convinced someone would soon realize she had received the invitation by mistake. She quietly took the last available seat near the back of the hall, hoping to leave unnoticed once the misunderstanding was discovered. As the orchestra slowly fell silent, the master of ceremonies stepped forward and welcomed the gathering before announcing that Prince Ethan Ashford wished to begin the proceedings in an unconventional manner. Confused murmurs spread through the audience as the great doors at the far end of the hall slowly opened. Instead of the prince dressed in ceremonial robes, a lone figure shuffled into the room wearing a weathered coat covered in dust, torn boots, patched trousers, a faded cap pulled low across his forehead, and a long, unkempt beard. Leaning heavily upon a worn wooden walking stick, the man slowly crossed the polished marble floor beneath the astonished gaze of hundreds of distinguished guests. Recognition never crossed their faces. To nearly everyone present, he appeared to be nothing more than the same homeless beggar many had ignored on the streets of Westhaven. Whispered laughter began spreading through the hall. Some guests exchanged puzzled smiles while others looked toward palace officials, assuming a terrible mistake had somehow interrupted the ceremony. Victoria Langford frowned with visible annoyance, whispering that security should never have allowed such a man inside the palace. Charlotte Bennet looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to watch the stranger remain at the center of so much attention. Several nobles quietly chuckled among themselves, wondering whether the palace had arranged some peculiar entertainment before the official announcement. Only one person in the room looked upon the weary stranger with immediate concern rather than embarrassment. Grace Carter instinctively rose halfway from her seat, worried that the confused man had wandered into the wrong place and might soon be humiliated before the entire court. Her heart ached as she remembered the afternoon she had first found him sitting alone outside the bakery with nothing more than exhaustion written across his face. She glanced toward the royal guards, silently hoping someone would guide him gently instead of forcing him from the hall. The stranger continued walking until he reached the exact center of the enormous room. There he stopped, resting both hands upon the wooden walking stick as complete silence gradually replaced the scattered laughter. Every eye remained fixed upon the mysterious figure. Even Queen Ethan Ashford watched without moving, her expression calm and unreadable. The stranger slowly lifted one trembling hand toward the faded cap resting upon his head. Without speaking a single word, he removed it and carefully placed it upon the polished marble floor. A few guests leaned forward in mild curiosity, still unable to understand what they were witnessing. Next came the rough gray beard. Reaching beneath it, the stranger carefully loosened the expertly crafted disguise before gently pulling it away from his face. Audible gasps immediately echoed throughout the grand hall. Conversations stopped in an instant. Several women instinctively covered their mouths in disbelief. Before anyone could process what they had just seen, the stranger untied the worn coat that had hidden his true appearance for weeks and allowed it to fall silently beside the cap. Beneath it stood the unmistakable uniform of the Crown Prince of West Haven. Prince Ethan Ashford stood tall before the stunned gathering, no longer bent beneath a false limp, no longer hiding behind worn clothing or carefully applied makeup. His posture reflected every portrait the kingdom had admired for years. The transformation was so complete that several guests instinctively rose from their seats without realizing they had done so. At that exact moment, every royal guard lining the walls of the grand hall dropped to one knee in perfect unison, their polished swords lowered respectfully toward the marble floor. Queen Ethan Ashford slowly rose from her throne with unmistakable pride shining in her eyes. Members of the royal council stood immediately afterward, followed by military commanders, foreign dignitaries, judges, governors, and finally every remaining guest throughout the hall. The silence that settled across the palace felt almost sacred. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. The room that only moments earlier had mocked a homeless beggar now stood speechless before the future king they had failed to recognize. Prince Ethan Ashford allowed the silence to linger before speaking with a calm voice that carried effortlessly to every corner of the magnificent hall.
For many months, my kingdom asked a single question: who would become the future queen of West Haven? Many believed the answer could be found through noble bloodlines, impressive fortunes, influential families, or carefully prepared introductions. I believed something different.
He slowly looked across the audience, his eyes briefly meeting those of Victoria Langford, Charlotte Bennet, and Amelia Brooks before continuing.
I walked through my own kingdom, wearing clothes that caused many people to look away before hearing my voice. I stood outside bakeries hungry. Some measured my worth by my appearance, others by my imagined failures. A few offered polite words, while quietly wishing I would disappear. Every encounter taught me something valuable.
He paused once more before delivering the sentence that would be remembered throughout West Haven for generations.
Every woman I met saw my appearance. Only one saw my humanity.
A quiet murmur swept through the crowd as Prince Ethan slowly turned toward the back of the grand hall. His eyes rested gently upon Grace Carter, who remained frozen where she stood, struggling to understand what was happening.
Grace Carter, would you please come forward?
Grace looked around in complete disbelief, convinced there must be another woman sharing her name somewhere inside the hall. Thomas Carter, seated nearby after receiving his own invitation from the palace only the previous evening, smiled through tear-filled eyes and gently nodded toward his daughter. With trembling hands, Grace slowly began walking down the long aisle between rows of astonished guests. Every step felt unreal. She could hear nothing except the sound of her own heartbeat. Victoria Langford stared after her in complete disbelief. Charlotte Bennet lowered her eyes. Amelia Brooks smiled softly, already beginning to understand what had happened. When Grace finally reached the front of the hall, she stopped a respectful distance from the prince, still unable to meet his eyes.
Your Highness, I don't understand.
Prince Ethan smiled gently, the same warm smile hidden beneath the disguise of a weary stranger only weeks earlier.
I know you don't. That's because every kindness you showed me was given without expecting this moment. Grace Carter first met me outside a bakery after believing I was a homeless man who had not eaten all day. She bought me a warm meal using money her own family could scarcely afford. She never asked my name. She never asked whether I deserved help. She simply noticed another human being in need. Later, when I appeared ill, she cared for me. When I was accused of theft before a crowd of strangers, she defended my dignity, even though doing so invited criticism toward herself. She stood beside a man everyone else believed had nothing to offer. She never realized that every act of kindness revealed far more about her than it ever did about me.
Tears slowly filled Grace's eyes as memories of those ordinary afternoons returned one by one. The warm bowl of soup, the loaf of bread, the medicine she had quietly purchased, the painful accusations inside the general store. None of those moments had seemed extraordinary at the time. They had simply felt like the right thing to do. Prince Ethan stepped one pace closer and lowered his voice, though every word remained clearly audible throughout the silent hall.
Grace, throughout this journey, you treated me as a prince because you believed I wasn't one. You treated me as a person. When the world you saw inconvenience, you saw someone worthy of dignity. When others measured value by clothing, wealth, and status, you measured it by humanity. You reminded me of the kind of king I want to become. You believed I had nothing to offer you, yet you gave without hesitation. Today, before my mother, this court, and the people of Westhaven, I want to thank you for seeing the man beneath the disguise.
The Grand Hall remained silent for only a heartbeat before Queen Ethan Ashford began applauding. One by one, members of the Royal Council joined her. The applause quickly spread across the entire hall until every guest rose to their feet. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others bowed their heads in quiet reflection. Even Victoria Langford, Charlotte Bennet, and Amelia Brooks understood that they had witnessed something far greater than the selection of a future queen. They had witnessed the triumph of character over appearance, compassion over ambition, and quiet goodness over public performance. As the applause echoed beneath the palace ceiling, Prince Ethan Ashford gently lifted Grace Carter's hand and looked toward the people he would one day lead. In that unforgettable moment, the kingdom of Westhaven realized that the greatest crown was never worn upon a person's head. It had always been carried within the heart. Several months passed after the unforgettable ceremony inside the Grand Hall of Westhaven Palace. Yet the events of that remarkable day continued to echo throughout every corner of the kingdom. What had begun as an extraordinary search for a future queen gradually became one of the most cherished stories ever told in Westhaven. Parents shared it with their children before bedtime. Teachers discussed it in classrooms while encouraging students to value integrity over appearance. Ministers quoted it during sermons about compassion and humility. Travelers carried the story across neighboring kingdoms, where many struggled to believe that a prince had willingly disguised himself as a homeless beggar to discover the true character of the woman he would marry. But those who knew Prince Ethan Ashford best understood that the journey had never truly been about choosing a wife. It had transformed the future king himself. The man who had left the palace searching for someone who would love him without a crown returned understanding that a ruler could never truly serve people whose struggles he had never taken the time to experience. The weeks he spent walking unnoticed among ordinary citizens remained the greatest education of his entire life. When Grace Carter officially became Queen Grace of Westhaven, many expected palace life to change her just as wealth and influence had changed so many others before her. Instead, something far more remarkable happened. The palace slowly began changing around her. Although servants now attended to her every need, Grace never forgot the simple habits that had shaped her character. She still greeted every palace employee by name, from the senior advisors to the youngest kitchen assistants. She often carried her own books through the palace corridors despite servants offering to help. On many mornings, members of the royal household quietly discovered the queen arranging flowers inside the palace chapel or visiting the royal kitchens simply to thank the cooks preparing meals for hundreds of staff members each day. When foreign dignitaries complimented her elegance during state banquets, Grace accepted their kindness with a warm smile but remained exactly the same woman who had once mended her own dresses by candlelight inside a modest cottage. She understood that titles could change where a person lived, but they should never change the kind of person they chose to become. True to the promise he had silently made during his weeks living as an ordinary man, King Ethan Ashford, after ascending to the throne following Queen Eleanor Ashford's retirement from public duties, began introducing reforms inspired not by royal tradition, but by the lessons he had learned while walking the streets unseen. Shelters throughout West Haven received greater royal support, so that no family would be left without a safe place during harsh winters. Community schools offering free education expanded into villages that had previously gone without qualified teachers, a project personally overseen by Queen Grace, who often surprised students by visiting classrooms without advance notice. New programs helped elderly citizens living alone receive regular care and medical assistance, ensuring fewer people experienced the loneliness Ethan had witnessed. During his journey, local councils established emergency funds for struggling families facing unexpected hardship, allowing temporary setbacks to become opportunities for recovery rather than lifelong burdens. Most importantly, every public servant employed by the crown, from palace officials to local magistrates, received a simple instruction from their king. Treat every citizen, Ethan told them, as though you cannot see their clothing, their wealth, or their title. See only the person standing before you. Those words gradually became one of the guiding principles of his reign. The story also changed the lives of others in ways few people expected. Victoria Langford spent many months reflecting upon the afternoon she had dismissed a weary stranger outside the garden fountain. For the first time, she recognized how easily privilege had blinded her to another person's dignity. Instead of retreating into embarrassment, she quietly dedicated herself to supporting organizations that help people experiencing homelessness rebuild their lives with practical skills and meaningful employment. She rarely spoke publicly about her reasons, believing genuine change required action rather than explanation. Charlotte Bennett returned to her work in education with renewed humility. She became known not only for thoughtful speeches, but for listening more carefully to voices society often overlooked. The memory of asking a waiter to remove a homeless man from the cafe remained with her for years, reminding her that polished manners meant very little unless they reflected a compassionate heart. Amelia Brooks continued building her family's publishing company, but success gradually took on a different meaning after witnessing the royal ceremony. Rather than measuring achievement by influence alone, she began using her resources to publish stories celebrating ordinary people whose quiet acts of courage rarely appeared in newspapers. None of the women became villains in the kingdom's memory. Instead, each allowed one painful lesson to become the beginning of personal growth, proving that even regret can become a powerful teacher when met with honesty. Thomas Carter often joked that becoming the father of a queen never changed his greatest concern, making sure his daughter remembered to eat before working too hard. Grace laughed every time he said it, insisting some fathers never truly stopped worrying. Despite moving into West Haven Palace, she visited the small cottage where they had lived together as often as royal responsibilities allowed. She refused to let it be demolished or replaced with something grander. Instead, the modest home was carefully preserved as a reminder that greatness does not begin inside palaces. It begins inside ordinary homes where compassion is practiced long before anyone notices. Children visiting the village often paused outside the cottage while parents quietly pointed toward its weathered front porch, reminding them that the future queen had once walked those same humble paths carrying vegetables home from the market. Grace never allowed those stories to make her feel extraordinary. Whenever someone praised her kindness, she simply smiled and answered with the same words she had spoken to Prince Ethan on the afternoon they first met. Sometimes people just need a good meal. As the years passed, visitors occasionally asked King Ethan Ashford which moment during his remarkable journey had changed him the most. Some expected him to mention the humiliation of being falsely accused of theft or the pain of hearing strangers judge him because of his appearance. Others believed he would speak about the unforgettable ceremony that introduced Queen Grace to the kingdom. Ethan always surprised them with the same answer. He said the moment that remained closest to his heart was far quieter than any royal celebration. It was the simple sound of Grace Carter placing a warm bowl of soup beside a tired stranger, without asking his name, his history, or whether he deserved her kindness. That ordinary act reminded him that the strongest foundations of a kingdom are not built through wealth, military strength, or magnificent buildings. They are built every day by ordinary people choosing compassion when no reward is waiting. And perhaps that is why the story of Prince Ethan Ashford and Queen Grace has continued to endure long after the voices that first told it had faded into history. Every generation discovers new reasons to remember it, because every generation faces the same quiet choice. Will we measure people by what they possess or by who they are? Will we judge appearances before listening to another person's story, or will we offer the dignity every human being deserves? Crowns may rest upon only a few heads, but kindness remains a choice available to everyone. Wealth can attract attention, but character earns lasting love. The heart that sees beyond appearances is the one worthy of a crown.